in a Changing Ireland 1900 to 1932. This presentation will aim to counteract the prevailing historiographical view of Southern Irish Protestants in the 20th century by focusing on the experiences and survival strategies of Methodists during the Revolutionary period. Methodism is a Protestant sect founded by John Wesley during the 18th century. It arrived in Ireland in 1752. Methodism has always been a minority within a minority in Ireland. At its peak, it had 60,000 adherents, most of whom lived in Northern Ireland. This has contributed to its neglect by historians, as we shall see. Most historiography of 20th century Irish Protestantism focuses on its decline and supersedure by Catholicism. This has led to an unchallenged narrative of Protestants being vanquished by Irish independence. Robin Burry has called them a silent, even silenced minority. Peter Hart caused controversy when he claimed that the IRA campaign in Cork amounted little more than an ethnic cleansing of Protestants. And even Ian Dalton, one of the foremost scholars of the Southern Irish Protestant experience, has said that they survived the revolution by keeping the head down. Another problem in this historiography is the homogenization of Protestantism. Historians tend to assume that the experience of ascendancy Anglicans was universal and exclude the experiences of smaller sects such as Presbyterianism, Baptism, and Methodism. My presentation will aim to challenge this. Methodism was in decline long before the Revolution. The internal migration to the traditional nerve centres and Protestant nerve centres of Ulster and Dublin was robbing rural and small town congregations of their young people, leaving them isolated and elderly. One must also note that Methodists were becoming increasingly paranoid at the prospect of Home Rule, which in 1914 seemed all but certain. Methodists were traditionally loyalists, and they even felt that Home Rule would lead to a diminution of their position in Ireland. At the 1914 conference, one Methodist said that he feared being shot down by nationalist bullets. Another disadvantage leading up to the revolution for Methodists was their fervent loyalty to the Crown. In 1913, at a fundraiser, the Reverend Wedgwood confidently declared that Methodists have never wavered in their loyalty to the throne. One must also note that sectarianism was rife at the annual conference. Indeed, one Bishop Burton said in 1906 that he eagerly awaited the day when the general revolt against Rome would arrive in Ireland and the Irish people would throw off Catholicism. However, one must also note that Methodism had very good financial resources in the lead up to the revolution. They possessed £692,124 worth of property, so they were in good financial health. And as well as that, they had a very strong youth culture. Youth organisations such as the Bands of Hope and Christian Engagement and the annual Young People's Conference provided Methodist children and young people with a strong sense of identity and allowed them to play an active role in their faith community. Methodists, and this may surprise you, but the Methodists did not perceive the Easter Rising as the prelude to a wider rebellion. Not even an attack on the Lower Abbey Street Church on the first anniversary altered this perception, when 59 panes of glass were broken by a hostile crowd. Their priorities at conferences remained in no particular order: World War I, their ceaseless temperance campaign, and the state of church finances. However, not by 1919, they could no longer ignore the rising tide of nationalism, so they decided to combat it by sending a deputation to America in order to counteract the narrative Sinn Féin was spreading there and to wake the sleeping giant of Ulster Protestantism. The deputation was headed by William Maguire, who in time would become the first Methodist chaplain of the Orange Order. They arrived in America in December 1919 and were initially successful. They were welcomed by the Episcopal Bishop of New York, and they preached against the evils of republicanism to 500 delegates there. However, things soon took a turn for the bad when Sinn Féin heard about their campaign and infiltrated their church services and shouted abuse such as "Hurrah for De Valera" and "Down with lying ministers." Then, in January 1920, a debate with Congressman E.P. Kincaid didn't go well. Reverend Corky alleged that Sinn Féin was no better than the International Workers of the World and was met by hisses and boos from the audience. And then the Reverend Rushingham of Chicago declared himself ashamed of them, saying, "It is a great mistake to think that the Irish movement for Irish independence is limited to the Roman Catholic faith." The deputation returned home disappointed. But it is important to note that their attempt to counteract Sinn Féin in America is proof that Protestants were most certainly not keeping the head down, even as the War of Independence kicked off. One cannot deny that Methodism did suffer during the Revolutionary period. For example, on the 7th of September 1919, a group of soldiers were fired on as they entered the Fermoy Methodist Church, and one of them died. The Black and Tan sacked the town afterwards. There were murders such as that of the RIC Inspector Wilson, a devout Methodist who was on his way to deliver a letter to the annual conference when he was murdered. It was displayed at the conference, stained with his blood. Congregations which could not afford to lose members, such as the Athlone Methodist Society and the Tullamore Circuit, did lose members, and they lost many. In some circuits, the number of babies baptised from 1910 to 1920 was a mere fraction of those baptised from 1890 to 1900. But Methodists did not despair at this. As a matter of fact, the tone at the 1921 conference was strangely ebullient. The Reverend J. M. Alley, whose previous year had involved lifting his bike over ditches in the road dug by the IRA, declared, "I would not have missed this past year in the South for anything." He was greeted with rapturous applause. So how did Methodists survive the revolution and emerge out on the other side? Well, their first strategy was one of pragmatic acceptance. At the 1923 conference, Tim Healy, the first Governor-General of the Irish Free State, was a guest of honour, and the attendees pledged loyalty to the provisional government. This may seem strange to you, but you must keep in mind that while Methodists were politically and culturally aligned with Britain, they did not consider themselves to be ethnically British. They felt themselves to be Irish. They were proud of the fact that their little church was independent of both the Church of Ireland and the Church of England. And so they were psychologically capable of uncoupling themselves from Britain. There may have been another factor. Having been abandoned by Northern Unionists, standing up for the faith against all odds may have lost its sheen. A second survival strategy which my research has uncovered was the proactive formation of clusters. These were areas where lots of Methodists kind of came to live together in stronghold towns and cities in order to protect their faith and culture and against the encroachment of a Gaelicized, Catholicized Ireland. You can see the strategy illustrated in these two maps. The first illustrates the map of baptisms on the Cork Kerry circuit from 1890 to 1900. Take a look and you'll see that there are small clumps of Methodists scattered all along the southwest coast. There are even some in the farthest reaches of the Gaeltacht. However, during the revolutionary period, it no longer became wise to live so far away from each other, and so as you can see, Methodists coagulated in Cork City, where they formed Methodist neighbourhoods. You can also see the strategy being used in Rathkeale and Adare. It may seem no one knows this, but Rathkeale and Adare are traditionally associated with Methodism. Indeed, the oldest Methodist church in Ireland is located very near Rathkeale, so it made sense for these towns to be the locations of clusters during the Revolution. So, to conclude, the above evidence shows that the story of Irish Protestantism in the early 20th century is far more complex than historiography has portrayed. Future writing on this topic should be far more nuanced. It should broaden its focus to include small denominations such as Methodism, Presbyterianism, Baptism, and even the Quakers. And it should use different theoretical lenses other than the narrative of decline, such as gender, political, and sport history. The truly remarkable thing about all this is how Methodists went from being terrified of even home rule to accepting the radically changed paradigm of the Irish Free State. They were able to survive by taking proactive measures to protect themselves and their culture in a Catholicized Ireland. And thanks to their efforts, the Methodist Church today is a vibrant institution, which thinks nothing of going on ecumenical initiatives with Catholics and other faiths. Thank you for listening, and God bless.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll stop the recording now and invite